The night was calm, the kind of quiet that settles over a city when most people have gone home for the evening. Streetlights flickered faintly above the sidewalks, casting soft yellow glows onto the pavement. In downtown Chicago, where the hum of life never truly faded, the streets were quieter than usual. A young woman named Maya Johnson walked briskly along the edge of the curb, her heels clicking softly against the concrete. She pulled her coat tighter around herself as a cool breeze swept through the narrow alleyways. Maya had just finished another long day at work. Her job wasn't one she could easily explain to others. It involved secrets, codes, and missions that often blurred the line between right and wrong. But tonight, all she wanted was to get home, pour herself a cup of tea, and forget about everything, for a while. The weight of her responsibilities pressed on her shoulders more heavily than usual, but she tried not to let it show. She always carried herself with confidence even when no one was watching. As she turned onto a quieter street, the sound of tires screeching against asphalt caught her attention. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw flashing red and blue lights, reflecting off the buildings ahead. At first, she thought the police car must be chasing someone else. She hadn't done anything wrong. Still, her pace slowed slightly as curiosity got the better of her. When the patrol car came to an abrupt stop beside her, her stomach tightened instinctively. Something about the situation felt off. The driver's side door opened and a man stepped out. He wore a standard-issue uniform complete with a badge pinned neatly to his chest. His nameplate read, Officer Miller. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features that made him look perpetually irritated. As he approached her, his hand rested casually on the holster of his gun. His eyes scanned her from head to toe before settling on her face. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gruff and authoritative. "Can I see your ID?" Maya blinked, taken aback by the request. She hadn't been speeding or jaywalking. She hadn't even crossed the street. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked politely, keeping her tone neutral. "No questions," Miller snapped. "Just show me your ID." For a moment, Maya considered arguing. After all, she had every right to ask why she was being stopped, but experience had taught her that sometimes it was easier to comply, especially when dealing with authority figures who seemed determined to assert their power. Reaching into her purse, she pulled out her wallet and handed over her driver's license. Miller took it without a word, holding it up to the light as if inspecting it for forgery. "You live around here?" he asked after a pause, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Yes," Maya replied evenly. "A few blocks away." Miller nodded slowly, though his expression remained skeptical. "What brings you out this late?" "I work late hours," Maya explained. "I'm heading home now." He glanced at her again, his gaze lingering on her professional attire, a tailored blazer, dark slacks, and polished shoes. For a brief second, she thought he might apologize for stopping her unnecessarily. Instead, he smirked. "You don't look like you belong in this neighborhood," he remarked, his words laced with thinly veiled judgment. Maya clenched her jaw, biting back the retort that sprang to mind. She'd heard comments like this before, subtle digs meant to undermine her presence in spaces where people like her weren't expected. It was exhausting, but she refused to let it rattle her. Instead, she decided to change the subject. "If there's no issue, I'd like to get going," she said firmly. "Oh, we're not done yet," Miller replied, stepping closer. His posture shifted, becoming more aggressive. "You seem awfully defensive for someone who hasn't done anything wrong," Maya sighed inwardly. This was exactly the kind of encounter she dreaded, the kind that escalated because someone couldn't resist flexing their authority. Deciding it was time to end the conversation, she reached into her bag again. This time, she pulled out a small leather case and flipped it open to reveal a shiny metal badge. "Actually, Officer Miller," she said, her voice steady, "I'm with the CIA, so unless you have a valid reason for detaining me, I suggest you let me go." Miller froze, staring at the badge in disbelief. Then, slowly, a smirk spread across his face. "Nice try," he said, chuckling. "You think I'm gonna fall for that? Everyone knows how easy it is to buy fake badges online these days." Maya's patience began to wear thin. She wasn't surprised by his reaction. People often doubted her credentials because of her appearance, but it still frustrated her. "Call my superior if you don't believe me," she said, handing him a business card with her agency's contact information printed on it. "Her name is Agent Bennett. She'll confirm everything." Miller snorted, tossing the card aside without looking at it. "Yeah, sure. And I'm the President of the United States." His laughter echoed down the empty street, grating on Maya's nerves. "Listen, sweetheart, I don't care what little game you're playing, you're not fooling anyone." By now, Maya's hands were trembling, not from fear, but from anger. She hated being dismissed, particularly by men like Miller, who assumed they knew better simply because of their position. Still, she forced herself to stay calm. Losing her temper wouldn't help the situation. "Fine," she said, taking a step back. "Do whatever you want, but don't say I didn't warn you." That's when things took a turn. Miller's smile faltered, replaced by a scowl. "What did you just say?" he demanded, his hand moving toward his gun. "Don't move," he barked, pointing the weapon at her chest. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Maya froze, raising her palms slowly. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her expression blank. She'd been trained for situations like this, how to de-escalate, how to stay alive. "Officer Miller," she said carefully, "you're making a mistake. Lower your weapon." But Miller wasn't listening. He was too busy laughing, his earlier amusement morphing into something darker. "Oh, this is rich," he sneered. "Little Miss CIA thinks she can scare me with her fake badge. What are you gonna do, huh? Call your spy friends to come save you?" Before Maya could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Actually, yes, that's exactly what she's going to do." Both Maya and Miller turned to see two black SUVs pulling up behind the patrol car. The doors swung open, and several agents emerged, dressed in crisp suits and sunglasses despite the hour. One of them, a tall woman with sharp cheekbones and an air of authority, strode forward. "Agent Bennett," she introduced herself, flashing her own badge. "And you are?" Miller's face went pale as realization dawned. He stammered, trying to explain himself, but Bennett silenced him with a wave of her hand. "Save it," she said coldly. "We'll discuss this back at headquarters." Within moments, Miller found himself disarmed and handcuffed, his earlier bravado evaporating completely. Maya watched silently as the scene unfolded, her emotions unreadable. As the agents led Miller away, Bennett turned to her. "Are you okay?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Maya nodded, exhaling deeply. "I'm fine," she said. "But this isn't the first time something like this has happened. We need to address it." Bennett placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We will," she promised. "But for now, let's get you home." As the SUVs drove off into the night, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was far from over. Little did she know, it was only the beginning of a much larger battle, one that would test her skills, her resolve, and her faith in the system she served. The next morning, the precinct buzzed with activity. News of what had happened the night before spread quickly among the officers, and by midday, it was the main topic of conversation in every corner of the building. Officer Greg Miller sat alone in a small holding cell at the back of the station, his hands cuffed to the metal bench beneath him. He stared blankly at the wall, replaying the events in his mind. How had things gone so wrong? One moment, he'd been laughing at that woman's ridiculous claim about being CIA, and the next he was surrounded by agents who didn't hesitate to take him down. Miller wasn't used to feeling powerless. For years he'd worn his uniform like armor, confident that it gave him authority over anyone he encountered. But now, sitting in this cold, sterile room, he realized how fragile that power really was. The agents hadn't even raised their voices when they arrested him. They simply moved with precision, leaving no room for argument. It was humiliating, and worse still, none of his colleagues seemed eager to defend him. In the main office area, Captain Lewis stood near the coffee machine, listening as two officers whispered heatedly nearby. "Did you hear?" one of them said, glancing toward the holding cells. "They say she's some big-shot agent, like international-level stuff." The other officer shook his head. "No way." "You believe that?" She just walks around looking like any other civilian, and suddenly we've got federal agents storming the place. Captain Lewis sighed heavily and turned away, rubbing his temples. He knew better than to trust gossip, but the truth wasn't. Much easier to swallow. Early that morning, he'd received a call from Agent Laura Bennett herself, confirming Maya Johnson's identity and explaining the severity of the situation. According to Bennett, Miller's actions weren't just reckless, they were potentially dangerous. If Johnson had been on an active mission, his interference could have jeopardized countless lives. Lewis didn't want to think about the implications. As far as he was concerned, Miller was a competent officer. Sometimes too aggressive, maybe, but not someone who deserved this kind of scrutiny. Still, the evidence against him was mounting. Internal Affairs had already begun reviewing past cases involving Miller, and early reports suggested a pattern of misconduct. Complaints filed by citizens accused him of racial profiling, excessive force, and intimidation tactics. None of these allegations had stuck before, but now they loomed large, threatening to tarnish the entire department. Meanwhile, Maya Johnson returned to her own workplace, a secure facility tucked away in an unassuming part of the city. Unlike the bustling police station, her office was quiet and orderly, filled with rows of desks occupied by analysts, typing furiously at their computers. She greeted a few colleagues as she made her way to her cubicle, where she dropped her bag and sank into her chair. Though outwardly composed, her thoughts churned with frustration. Encounters like last night's were supposed to be rare, yet they kept happening more frequently. Each time she reminded herself that staying calm was key, that losing her temper would only give people like Miller ammunition to use against her, but it was getting harder to hold on to that resolve. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Agent Bennett asking her to come to a meeting in the conference room. When Maya arrived, she found Bennett seated at the head of the table, flanked by two senior agents. They exchanged polite nods before diving straight into business. So, Bennett began, leaning forward slightly, "I assume you're aware of the fallout from last night's incident?" Maya nodded. "I heard rumors this morning. People are talking." Bennett gave a dry smile. "Of course they are. This isn't exactly the kind of thing that stays quiet. What I need to know is whether you feel comfortable continuing your current assignment. Given what happened, it might be wise to consider reassignment." For a moment, Maya hesitated. She appreciated Bennett's concern, but walking away wasn't an option. Not now. "I'm fine," she said firmly. "Look, I understand why you're asking, but backing off will only make things worse. If anything, this proves we need to address the systemic issues behind situations like these." One of the senior agents raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting we tackle law enforcement corruption as part of your mission?" "Not directly," Maya clarified. "But incidents like this don't happen in isolation. There are larger forces at play here, networks of influence that exploit weaknesses in the system. If Miller thought he could act with impunity, it's because someone higher up encouraged it." The room fell silent as everyone processed her words. Finally, Bennett spoke. "If that's true, then we'll need solid proof, and given your position, you're uniquely qualified to gather it." Maya nodded again, determination hardening her expression. "I'll start digging immediately." Back at the precinct, Miller's colleagues continued debating his fate. Some argued that he'd been set up, claiming that federal agents often exaggerated minor infractions to assert dominance. Others pointed out that his behavior had always been problematic, making it easy for critics to paint him as the villain. Amidst the arguments, Captain Lewis called a meeting to discuss the case officially. "Listen up," he said, standing at the front of the crowded briefing room. "We've got a serious issue on our hands. Internal Affairs is investigating Miller, and depending on what they find, this could escalate beyond our control. Our priority right now is cooperation. No excuses, no defensiveness, just transparency." A murmur rippled through the crowd. One officer raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir, do we know for sure that Johnson's credentials are legit? I mean, couldn't this all be some kind of misunderstanding?" Lewis fixed him with a stern look. "Agent, Bennett personally confirmed her status, so unless you're prepared to challenge the CIA's word, I suggest you focus on what matters, ensuring this doesn't happen again." As the meeting concluded, Miller remained oblivious to the discussions swirling around him. When Captain Lewis finally visited him in the holding cell, he looked up expectantly, hoping for reassurance. Instead, Lewis delivered bad news. "Greg," he said, his tone somber, "you're suspended pending further investigation. IA wants to speak with you tomorrow, and until then, you're confined here." Miller's face flushed with anger. "This is insane. You can't let them railroad me like this." "I'm sorry," Lewis replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Until we get clarity, there's nothing I can do." After Lewis left, Miller slumped back against the bench, seething. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being punished unfairly. Sure, maybe he'd pushed things too far with Johnson, but wasn't that part of the job? Keeping order sometimes required tough decisions. Or so he told himself. Unbeknownst to him, Maya was already piecing together clues that would expose the truth. Using access granted by her agency, she reviewed public records related to Miller's career. Patterns emerged almost instantly. Complaints about racial bias, vague explanations for escalated confrontations, and connections to influential figures within the department. All signs pointed to something bigger than a single rogue cop. Late that evening, Maya met with Bennett once more to share her findings. "It's not just Miller," she explained, spreading documents across the table. "He's part of a network. Someone's been feeding him targets, using him to intimidate certain groups while shielding themselves from accountability." Bennett studied the papers carefully, her brow furrowing. "Do you think he knows who's pulling the strings?" "He might," Maya admitted. "But if he does, he's either too scared or too loyal to talk. Either way, we'll need leverage to break him." The two women spent hours strategizing, mapping out potential leads and identifying key players who could provide insight into the operation. By the time they finished, the clock had ticked well past midnight. Exhausted but determined, Maya gathered her notes and headed home, her mind racing with possibilities. As she walked through the empty streets, she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. Every step she took brought her closer to uncovering the truth, but it also deepened her awareness of the challenges ahead. Corruption didn't exist in isolation. It thrived in shadows, feeding on fear and complacency. To dismantle it, she would need more than evidence. She would need allies willing to stand against those who benefited from the status quo. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Maya's apartment, casting long streaks of light across her living room. She sat at her dining table, surrounded by papers and files spread out like a puzzle waiting to be solved. A steaming cup of coffee sat untouched beside her laptop, its warmth radiating faintly against the cool air. Her eyes scanned the documents again, searching for anything she might have missed. Patterns were beginning to emerge, connections between officers, like Miller and certain influential figures within the city, but they were still too vague to act on. For now, all she had was a web of names and dates, threads that needed pulling carefully. Maya knew time was critical. If word got out that she was investigating corruption tied to law enforcement, it could jeopardize everything. People in power didn't take kindly to having their secrets exposed, especially when those secrets involved illegal activities. Still, she couldn't afford to wait. Every day that passed gave them more opportunities to cover their tracks or silence anyone who might talk. She picked up her phone and dialed Agent Bennett's number. "Bennett," came the crisp reply after a few rings. "It's me," Maya said, lowering her voice instinctively, though no one else was around. "I've gone through the records again. There's definitely something bigger going on here. I need resources, someone who can dig deeper into financial transactions." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You think this is about money?" Bennett asked. "I don't know yet," Maya admitted. "But if these guys are using cops to intimidate people, there has to be a payoff somewhere. Maybe kickbacks, maybe bribes. Either way, following the money trail is our best bet." Bennett sighed softly. "All right, I'll see what I can arrange. But be careful, Maya. This isn't just about rogue cops anymore. Once we start looking into finances, we're stepping into dangerous territory." Maya nodded, even though Bennett couldn't see her. "I understand." Just get me the tools I need. At the precinct, tensions continued to simmer. Captain Lewis called another meeting with his senior staff, hoping to address growing concerns among the officers. Rumors about Miller's suspension and the reasons behind it had spread like wildfire, dividing the team into factions. Some supported Miller, arguing that he'd been set up by federal agents eager to make an example of him. Others quietly agreed with the investigation, believing it was long overdue. "We're under a microscope right now," Lewis told the group, pacing back and forth in front of the conference table. "Internal Affairs is digging into Miller's record, and trust me, they're not holding back. Whatever you hear, whatever you think you know, keep your mouth shut until we have facts." Understood? The officers exchanged uneasy glances but nodded reluctantly. One of them, a veteran detective named Rodriguez, raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir, do we know why the CIA got involved? I mean, this seems unusual." Lewis hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "From what I've been told, Agent Johnson was on assignment when Miller stopped her. Whether her mission was related to his actions, I can't say. But the point is, we can't afford any mistakes right now. Not with IA breathing down our necks." Rodriguez frowned but said nothing further. The meeting ended shortly afterward, leaving everyone to grapple with their own thoughts. As the officers filed out of the room, Rodriguez lingered behind, watching Lewis intently. "You really think Miller's clean?" he asked bluntly once they were alone. Lewis stopped mid-step, turning to face him. "Does it matter what I think? What matters is whether he broke the rules. And based on what IA's finding, it doesn't look good." Rodriguez crossed his arms, his expression grim. "If he did break the rules, he's not the only one. You know as well as I do how things work around here. Someone always pulls the strings." Lewis stared at him for a moment before shaking his head. "Just focus on your job, Rodriguez. Let IA handle the rest." Meanwhile, Greg Miller remained locked in the holding cell, his frustration boiling over. He hadn't spoken to anyone since Captain Lewis's visit the previous day, and the isolation was wearing on him. When a guard finally brought him food that afternoon, he seized the opportunity to vent. "What's going on?" he demanded, gripping the bars of his cell. "Am I supposed to rot in here forever?" The guard shrugged indifferently. "Talk to Internal Affairs, they're running the show now." Miller scowled, pacing back and forth in the cramped space. His mind raced with questions. Who was pulling the strings? Why had those agents shown up so quickly? And most importantly, how could he prove he wasn't the bad guy in all this? Later that evening, Maya met with a forensic accountant named Claire Dawson, a specialist assigned by Bennett to assist with the investigation. Claire was in her late 30s with sharp features and an analytical gaze that seemed to miss nothing. They settled into a private office at the agency's headquarters, stacks of financial reports piled high between them. "So," Claire began, tapping a pen against the edge of the desk, "what exactly am I looking for?" Maya leaned forward, pointing to several highlighted sections on one of the pages. "These accounts belong to individuals connected to Miller, or at least, that's what my research suggests. Start by tracing any unusual transfers or deposits. Look for patterns, especially ones that coincide with major incidents involving Miller." Claire nodded, already jotting notes. "Got it. Anything else?" "One more thing," Maya added. "Keep an eye out for offshore accounts. If they're laundering money, that's probably where it'll lead." As Claire dove into the data, Maya stepped outside to clear her head. The hallway was quiet, lit by soft fluorescent lights that hummed faintly overhead. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. Despite the progress they were making, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Paranoia came with the job, but something about this case felt different. It wasn't just the stakes, it was the players involved. Whoever was orchestrating this operation wasn't just powerful, they were smart. And smart enemies were always the hardest to catch. Back at the precinct, Internal Affairs investigators arrived early the next morning to question Miller. They led him to a small interrogation room, where he sat slumped in a chair, glaring at the two men across from him. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, introduced himself as Detective Harris. "Let's cut to the chase," Harris said, placing a folder on the table. "We're reviewing your conduct during recent incidents, including your encounter with Agent Johnson. Care to explain yourself? Miller shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. I was doing my job, he muttered. She didn't belong in that neighborhood. I was checking for suspicious activity. Harris raised an eyebrow. Suspicious activity? Based on what, her race? No, Miller snapped, his voice rising. It wasn't about that. She acted weird, okay? Like she was hiding something. And when she showed you her badge, you laughed. Harris continued, consulting his notes. Why? Miller clenched his fists, struggling to stay composed. Because it sounded fake. How was I supposed to know she was telling the truth? The second investigator, a younger woman named Patel, leaned forward. Did anyone tell you to target specific individuals in the past? Anyone give you instructions beyond standard protocol? Miller hesitated, caught off guard by the question. What are you talking about? Nobody tells me what to do. Patel exchanged a glance with Harris before pressing further. Are you sure? Because we found evidence suggesting otherwise. Certain cases you worked on involved individuals linked to organized crime. Coincidence? Miller's face paled. I don't know anything about that, he stammered. I swear. Harris closed the folder and stood up. We'll be in touch, he said simply, signaling the end of the interview. As the investigators left the room, Miller slumped back in his chair, sweat trickling down his forehead. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. Had he been used? Was he just a pawn in someone else's game? That same day, Maya received an update from Claire. I found something interesting, Claire said, handing her a printed report. Several of the accounts you flagged have connections to offshore banks, and guess what? One of them belongs to a retired police captain named Harold Grayson. Maya's eyes widened. Grayson? He used to oversee operations in this district years ago. What's he doing mixed up in this? That's your department, Claire replied with a shrug. But if I were you, I'd start asking questions. Maya thanked her and immediately called Bennett. We've got a lead, she said without preamble. Harold Grayson. He might be the key to unraveling this whole mess. Bennett sounded cautious but intrigued. Be careful, Maya. If Grayson's involved, he's not going down without a fight. I know, Maya replied, her voice firm. But we're getting closer. I can feel it. As night fell over the city, Maya prepared for the next phase of her investigation. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, each discovery bringing her nearer to the truth. Yet with every step forward, the stakes grew higher. Somewhere out there, shadowy figures were watching, waiting to see if she'd slip up. And Maya knew one thing for certain. Failure wasn't an option. The city buzzed with its usual energy as Maya Johnson stepped out of her car and onto a quiet street, lined with old brick buildings. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain from earlier in the day. She adjusted her coat and glanced at her watch. It was nearly midnight, but she wasn't here to rest. Her mind raced with plans, strategies, and questions that still needed answers. Tonight, she was meeting someone who might hold the key to unraveling the web of corruption surrounding Officer Greg Miller, and possibly much more. Harold Grayson had been retired for over a decade, but his name kept popping up in connection with suspicious activities within the police department. Once a respected captain known for his tough leadership style, Grayson had faded into obscurity after leaving the force, or so everyone thought. Maya's investigation revealed that he'd maintained ties with influential figures both inside and outside law enforcement. His offshore account suggested he was involved in something far bigger than anyone realized. Maya approached an unassuming diner on the corner, its neon sign flickering weakly above the door. Inside, the place was nearly empty except for a few late-night patrons scattered across booths. At the back, seated by himself, was Harold Grayson. He looked older than his photos, his once imposing frame now slightly hunched. His gray hair was thinning and deep lines etched his face, but his sharp eyes betrayed a man who hadn't lost his edge. Maya slid into the booth across from him, her movements deliberate and calm. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her tone polite, but firm. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Grayson studied her for a moment before speaking. "You're not what I expected," he admitted, his voice gravelly but steady. "I figured they'd send someone older, more intimidating." Maya smiled faintly. "Appearances can be deceiving." Grayson chuckled dryly. "Ain't that the truth?" He leaned back in his seat, folding his arms. "So, Agent Johnson, what do you want? You didn't drag me out here for small talk." "No, I didn't," Maya replied, pulling a folder from her bag and sliding it across the table. Inside were copies of financial records, emails, and other documents linking Grayson to questionable transactions. "We know about your offshore accounts, Mr. Grayson, and we know you've stayed connected to certain individuals within the department." Grayson glanced at the folder, but didn't touch it. Instead, he sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I figured this day would come eventually. What do you want me to say?" "The truth," Maya said simply. "Who's pulling the strings? Who told officers like Greg Miller to target specific people?" Grayson hesitated, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he stared at the folder, weighing his options. Finally, he spoke. "It's not just one person," he said quietly. "It's a group. They call themselves the Syndicate. They've been around for years, working behind the scenes. They use cops like pawns, intimidating business owners, silencing whistleblowers, making sure no one gets too curious." Maya nodded, absorbing the information. "And you worked with them?" "I didn't have a choice," Grayson snapped, his voice rising slightly. "When they approached me, they made it clear there was no saying no. Either I played along or I ended up dead, or worse." "Worse?" Maya asked, leaning forward. "They'd ruin you," Grayson explained bitterly. "Your family, your reputation, everything you care about. Trust me, I've seen it happen." Maya studied him carefully. Despite his gruff exterior, there was fear in his eyes, a fear that went beyond losing his freedom. He knew how dangerous these people were, and now so did she. "What else can you tell me?" she pressed gently. "Names, locations, anything that could help us take them down." Grayson shook his head. "I don't know much. They keep things compartmentalized, but—" He paused, glancing around the diner nervously. "There's a meeting tomorrow night. A big one. If you want to catch them in action, that's your chance." Maya's heart quickened. This was the break she'd been waiting for. "Where?" "At an old warehouse near the docks," Grayson replied. "They'll be discussing their next moves. But listen, if you go in there without backup, you won't make it out alive. These guys don't mess around." "We'll handle it," Maya assured him, though her mind was already racing with possibilities. "One last thing. Who's leading? Them?" Grayson hesitated again, clearly torn between loyalty and self-preservation. "His name's Victor Lang," he said finally. "He used to run a private security firm before disappearing off the grid. Now he's the head of the Syndicate." As they wrapped up the conversation, Maya thanked Grayson for his cooperation. She promised him protection in exchange for his testimony, knowing full well that he'd need it if the Syndicate discovered his betrayal. When she left the diner, the weight of what lay ahead settled heavily on her shoulders. She had a lead, but it came with risks. Taking down a group like the Syndicate wouldn't be easy. They were smart, ruthless, and well-connected. Still, Maya refused to back down. Too many lives depended on stopping them. Back at headquarters, Maya briefed Agent Bennett and the rest of her team on what she'd learned. The room buzzed with tension as everyone processed the implications. They weren't just dealing with corrupt cops anymore. They were facing a criminal organization with tentacles reaching into every corner of the city. "This changes everything," Bennett said, pacing in front of the whiteboard where Maya had outlined the details of the operation. "If the Syndicate is as powerful as Grayson says, we'll need to move carefully. One wrong step and they'll scatter." "We also need proof," added Claire Dawson, the forensic accountant who had uncovered the offshore accounts. "Without solid evidence, we won't stand a chance in court." Maya nodded. "That's why we focus on tomorrow's meeting. If we can record their conversations, gather documents, anything that ties them to illegal activities, We'll have enough to shut them down. Bennett turned to face her. Do you think Grayson will stick to his story under pressure? Can we trust him? He's scared, Maya replied. And he knows what happens if he crosses them again. As long as we protect him, he'll cooperate. After hours of planning, the team finalized their strategy. Surveillance teams would monitor the warehouse from a safe distance, while Maya and a small unit infiltrated the meeting using advanced listening devices and hidden cameras. Every precaution was taken to ensure their safety, but Maya knew danger was inevitable. She couldn't afford to let fear slow her down. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Captain Lewis continued grappling with the fallout from Miller's arrest. Internal affairs had uncovered damning evidence linking him to multiple cases of misconduct, including several incidents involving racial profiling and excessive force. Worse still, investigators found text messages suggesting he'd received instructions from higher-ups, though none directly named Harold Grayson or the syndicate. Faced with mounting pressure, Lewis called another meeting with his senior staff. This isn't just about Miller anymore, he told them, his voice heavy with frustration. IA's digging deeper, and if they find out what we all suspect, that corruption runs deeper than one bad apple, it'll destroy this department. Detective Rodriguez raised a skeptical eyebrow. You really think IA doesn't already know? They've been sniffing around for weeks. Someone tipped them off. Lewis frowned, but didn't deny it. All I'm saying is we need to get ahead of this. If we can identify who's behind it, maybe we can salvage some credibility. Rodriguez exchanged a glance with another officer before responding. And if we can't? What then? The question hung in the air, unanswered. By the time evening rolled around, Maya and her team were ready. Dressed in dark clothing and equipped with cutting-edge surveillance gear, they moved silently through the shadows toward the warehouse. The building loomed ahead, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. From the outside, it looked abandoned, but inside the syndicate was plotting their next move. Using a thermal imaging device, Maya scanned the interior. Several figures were gathered in a large open space, their voices muffled but audible through the walls. She signaled to her team, and together they positioned themselves strategically, ensuring maximum coverage. For the next hour, Maya listened intently as Victor Lang and his associates discussed their operations. They talked about bribes, blackmail, and even threats against local politicians. Every word they spoke was recorded, every document photographed. By the time they left the area, Maya felt a surge of triumph. They had what they needed, but as they retreated into the night, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that victory was still far away. Bringing down the syndicate would require more than evidence. It would demand courage, resilience, and an unshakable belief in justice. And as she climbed into the van with her team, she vowed to see it through no matter the cost. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, Maya allowed herself a small smile. They were closer than ever to exposing the truth and bringing those responsible to justice. The morning after the warehouse operation, Maya sat in a dimly lit conference room at CIA headquarters. The room buzzed with quiet energy as her team reviewed the evidence they had gathered. Screens displayed transcripts of recorded conversations, photos of incriminating documents, and maps marking key locations tied to the syndicate's operations. Claire Dawson typed furiously on her laptop, organizing the data into a coherent presentation. Agent Bennett stood at the front of the room, her arms crossed as she studied the materials. This is it, Bennett said finally, breaking the silence. We've got them. Maya nodded, though her expression remained cautious. It's enough to bring charges against Victor Lang and his associates, but we need to act fast. If word gets out that we're onto them, they'll disappear. Bennett. Agreed. I'll contact federal prosecutors immediately. In the meantime, we secure Grayson. If he testifies, it'll seal the case. As the team worked through the details, Maya couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and unease. They had uncovered something massive, something that could dismantle an entire criminal network, but the stakes were higher than ever. People like Victor Lang didn't surrender quietly. She knew there would be consequences for exposing them, not just for herself but for everyone involved. At the precinct, Captain Lewis received a call from Internal Affairs. The investigators informed him that their probe into Greg Miller's actions had expanded significantly. Evidence tying Miller to the syndicate was mounting, and his testimony could prove crucial in unraveling the corruption within the department. When Lewis relayed this information to Miller during another tense meeting, the officer's face turned pale. "You want me to testify?" Miller asked, his voice trembling. "Against those guys? Are you insane?" Lewis leaned forward, his tone firm. "You don't have a choice, Greg. This isn't about you anymore. It's about saving whatever's left of this department's integrity." Miller buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by the weight of the situation. For years he'd followed orders without questioning where they came from or why. Now, he realized he'd been nothing more than a pawn, a tool used by powerful people who cared little for his future. He felt trapped, betrayed, and utterly alone. "I'll do it," he muttered after a long pause. "But only if you promise to protect me." Lewis nodded solemnly. "We'll make sure you're safe. Just tell us everything you know." Meanwhile, Victor Lang and his associates became aware that they were being watched. Whispers of betrayal spread quickly among the syndicate's members and paranoia set in. Lang called an emergency meeting at a secluded location outside the city, determined to identify the leak. His sharp eyes scanned the faces of those seated around the table, searching for signs of guilt. "We've got a problem," Lang began, his voice cold and measured. "Someone talked, and unless we figure out who, we're all finished." One of the men shifted uncomfortably. "Could it be Grayson? He's been acting strange lately." Lang's jaw tightened. "Find him. Bring him here, alive if possible." Unbeknownst to Lang, Harold Grayson was already under federal protection. Agents had relocated him to a secure facility, ensuring his safety while preparing him to testify. When news of Lang's order reached Maya, she knew time was running out. If Lang discovered Grayson's whereabouts, he wouldn't hesitate to strike. "We need to move faster," Maya told Bennett later that day. "If Lang finds him, we lose our best witness." Bennett nodded grimly. "Then let's hit them hard before they regroup. Get everything ready for the prosecution. We go public tomorrow." The next morning, federal agents raided multiple locations linked to the syndicate. Armed with warrants and backed by overwhelming evidence, they arrested Victor Lang and several high-ranking members of the organization. News of the takedown spread rapidly, dominating headlines across the country. Reporters described the syndicate as a shadowy cabal that had manipulated law enforcement, silenced dissent, and profited from illegal activities for years. In the days that followed, Greg Miller appeared before a grand jury, providing detailed accounts of how he had been coerced into targeting specific individuals. His testimony corroborated Maya's findings and further solidified the case against Lang and his associates. Though Miller faced charges for his role in the conspiracy, his cooperation earned him leniency. Harold Grayson also testified, his voice steady despite the fear etched on his face. He admitted to working with the syndicate under duress and identified key players involved in their operations. His words carried immense weight, helping prosecutors secure convictions against nearly every member of the group. As the dust settled, Maya found herself reflecting on the events that had unfolded. She stood on the rooftop of CIA headquarters, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The city stretched out before her, its lights twinkling like stars. Despite the victory, she felt no sense of triumph, only a deep awareness of how fragile justice truly was. Agent Bennett joined her moments later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You did good," she said, handing one to Maya. "This wouldn't have happened without you." Maya accepted the cup but didn't drink from it. "It's not over," she replied softly. "There will always be others like Lang, others who think they're untouchable." Bennett nodded. "That's why we keep fighting, one battle at a time." For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was comforting, filled with the shared understanding that their work never truly ended. But, for now, they had won, and sometimes that was enough. Later that week, Maya visited the precinct to check on Captain Lewis and his team. The atmosphere inside was markedly different from when she'd last been there. Officers moved with renewed purpose, their steps lighter, their expressions less guarded. Internal affairs had cleared many of them of wrongdoing, vindicating those who had resisted the syndicate's influence. Captain Lewis greeted Maya warmly, gratitude evident in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "You saved this department." Maya shook her head. "I just did my job. It's up to you and your team to rebuild trust. That won't be easy." Lewis acknowledged her words with a nod. "We'll get there. Slowly, but we will." Before leaving, Maya decided to pay Miller a visit. He sat in a small holding cell, awaiting transfer to a minimum security facility. When she approached, he looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone wary. Maya studied him for a moment before speaking. "I wanted to see how you were holding up." Miller shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "I messed up, bad. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I guess I wasn't." "No, you weren't," Maya agreed bluntly. "But admitting that is the first step. Don't waste this chance to change." Miller met her eyes briefly, a flicker of determination crossing his features. "I won't," he promised. "Not again." Satisfied, Maya turned to leave. As she walked away, she felt a small measure of hope. Change was possible even for someone like Miller. It wouldn't happen overnight, but with effort it could take root. That night, Maya returned home, exhausted but content. She poured herself a glass of wine and settled onto her couch, staring at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed beside her, displaying a text from Bennett. "Mission accomplished. Rest up, you've earned it." Maya smiled faintly, setting the phone aside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But for tonight, she allowed herself to breathe, to savor the fleeting peace that came with knowing she had made a difference. And as sleep claimed her, she dreamed of cities bathed in light, where shadows held no power and justice reigned supreme.